Cognito, Customer Identity and Access Management Service, means it is used to handle identity and access management for end users of your mobile or web application. And Cognito have two kinds of offering: user pool and identity pool. So user pool is like a collection of all users of your application, and it is used to add secure authentication and authorization mechanism to your application. On another hand, identity pool, it is used to grant temporary access to a user's resources to your end users. Now there is another service from AWS called AWS IAM, which stands for Identity and Access Management. And both IAM and Cognito have kind of overlapping functionalities, which cause confusion. So let's see what is the difference. So both IAM and Cognito are useful for identity and access management, but IAM is more focused on controlling access to AWS as resources, so IAM have two kind of entities called IAM users and IAM roles, and here our concern is that which IAM entity can access what AWS resource to what extent. So suppose there is IAM user, then we can define that it can access some yester bucket, and there it can put and get the objects, but it can't delete the object. However, with Cognito, our focus is more on the end users of application. So like carrying out things like authentication and authorization of user, if user is valid or not, and if user is not registered, then register a user, so login and sign up functionality. Also with AWS Cognitive Identity Pool, we can bridge our end users to AWS resources with the help of IAM roles, so that we will see later in the same slide. For now, let's see the example. So here I suppose I have this ADB account, and I want to access services like Landline S3. Then I will use IAM user with console access and necessary permissions to build and create or delete these services in ADB console. So this is the functionality of IAM user. Now suppose there is a service, let's say Lambda, and it wants to talk to Dynamod in my account. For this purpose I will use IAM role. So IAM role is also like user, but it can be assumed by some service like Ikena. This Lambda can assume this IAM role, and this role will contain necessary policy documents, or that policy will contain necessary permissions, and that it is what access it's allowed to do with this Dynamod. And coming to Cognito, as we discussed, its focus more on the end user. So suppose we have EC2 instance, and it is hosting a web server, and some random user is asking for the list of DOS. So when it comes that when request comes to our server, here our purpose is to check if this user is valid. And if user is valid, if user is not valid, then send them to login page or registration page, and then get information regarding user, like what is user ID, and use this user ID to do something for this user from database. So this is the functionality of user pool, mainly authentication and authorization. Now a scenario like we already discussed, that Cognito can also be used in combination with IAM. So imagine scenario where end user wants to get something from history bucket directly, or in simple words, it wants access to history bucket. So what we can do, so for this purpose we use cognitive identity pools. So coming here, we saw that we have user pools and identity pools. So we are talking about second service from AWS Cognito and an identity pool. What happens is that We can give temporary access to AWS resources to users. And this user can be random guest. User means an unauthenticated user. Or we can use Google as identity provider. Or Facebook as identity provider. Or even, we can use Cognito user pool as identity provider. So this will be the flow. Suppose if user wants to get something from history, so they will not directly call history and try to fetch the objects. What they will do, they will first go to the identity provided like Google, Facebook, or cognitive user pool, or even they can't escape this. But then generally for guest users, we define less permissions as compared to the authenticated users. So first they will go to identity provider, and then they will receive necessary watch tokens, and then they will go to this Cognito identity pool, and then they will show the identity pool that I have this token, and identity pool will already be configured with these providers, and then identity pool will recognize that this token is valid, so it will use AWS service to assume the role for some specific period of time, and then for that the role it is assumed, it will create credentials, and then those credentials it will give back to user. And we will see this in detail, how these credentials are created. But for now, if we want to see these credentials, look something like this. So here we can see that these credentials are returned by identity pool. It contains access, identity, expiry, and time, secret key, and access token. So ID pool will return these credentials back to user. And then these credentials will be used by this user to make API call to yesteryear bucket. And then yesteryear bucket will return necessary object response if the credential, which is passed to yesteryear's vault. So these were the difference between IAM and Cognito. And also we saw difference between user pool and ID pool. To summarize, user pool is for authentication and authorization. ID pool is to get temporary access to US resources with the help of STs and IAM. And IAM is to control access to our US resources.